I didn't go to the union for the house. That matters. If you go looking for a haunting, you arrive already compromised. You hear what you expect. You connect dots that want to be connected. Fear becomes collaborative. I wasn't in that position. I went because union was quiet, because it was cheap, and because the house had been empty long enough that no one bothered asking questions anymore. The deed was old, pre-Civil War. The paper smelled faintly of dust and iron, like it had been folded too many times by hands that didn't expect the future to care. The seller said only one thing that stuck with me: people don't stay. Not won't. Don't. The house sat a little too far back from the road, its porch sagging inward as if I tried to holding itself upright. The windows were intact but dark, not broken, not boarded, just watching. The kind of house that looks abandoned without ever fully committing to decay, like it was waiting for something to resume. Inside, the air was cold in a way that didn't match the season. Late summer, heat pressed down outside, but the moment I stepped across the threshold, it felt like walking into a cellar that had never been opened. The smell wasn't rot. It was old wood and something sharper beneath it. Not blood, not mold. Something dry and animal, like a throat that had screamed itself raw long ago. The layout was simple, too simple. A straight hallway from the front door, rooms branching left and right, stairs at the end leading up, no clutter, no furniture, no signs of vandalism, just emptiness that felt maintained rather than neglected. I took the back bedroom on the ground floor. I didn't like the stairs. They were narrow and worn down the center, as if generations of feet had climbed them in a hurry. I told myself it was superstition. That houses always feel stranger at night. That silence fills itself if you give it enough space. I was unpacking when the sound happened. Not loud, not sudden. It started as a pressure. That's the only way to describe it. Like the air in the room tightened, as if the walls leaned in by a fraction too small to measure. My ears popped gently, the kind of sensation you get when an elevator stops between floors. Then came the sound, a scream, but stretched, not sharp, not explosive, long, continuous, thin. It came from inside the house, not above me, not below, not through the walls. It left embedded, threaded through the structure itself, vibrating through the beams and floorboards, as if the house was using its own bones to produce the sound. I stood completely still. The scream didn't rise or fall. It didn't gasp or breathe. It didn't strain. It simply continued, unwavering, like a note held by something that didn't require lungs. After maybe 10 seconds or maybe a minute, time felt unreliable. It stopped, not fading, stopping. The pressure released at the same instant, like something had finished speaking. I waited, listening for footsteps, for laughter, for proof of machinery, prank, anything human. There was nothing. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound itself. I didn't leave. That's important too, because at that moment, I still believed the house was empty. And houses, I thought, don't scream on purpose. Not yet. I didn't sleep after the first scream. I lay on the mattress fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle into itself, wood contracting, pipes clicking faintly, the normal vocabulary of an old structure trying to convince me it was still ordinary. It failed, because every sound felt deliberate now. Each creak carried timing. Each shift felt placed, like punctuation rather than decay. Near dawn, I walked the hallway with a flashlight. The beam caught dust motes hanging in the air, unmoving, as if the house itself had learned how to hold still. I pressed my palm against the wall where the scream had seemed strongest. The plaster was cold, not damp, not cracked, cold in a way that reminded me of stone left too long in shade. There were marks I hadn't noticed before, faint grooves in the woodwork near the baseboards, parallel, too regular to be scratches, too shallow to be damage. They followed the hallway in long, interrupted lines, vanishing under door frames, reappearing farther down like something had dragged something narrow and rigid through the house repeatedly over many years. I followed them to the staircase. Up close, the stairs were worse than I remembered. The center was worn smooth, but the sides, the edges were scarred. Gouges pressed deep into the risers, some angled upward, others straight in, as if something had been braced against them while force was applied from below. I didn't climb them. I backed away instead and stepped outside just as the sky began to lighten. The house looked different in early morning, less threatening, more embarrassed, like it had been caught doing something private. That's when I noticed the neighbors, not watching, avoiding. The nearest house sat a few hundred yards down the road. An older man stood by his fence, pretending to repair it while glancing in my direction just often enough to confirm I was still there. When I waved, he didn't wave back. Later, at the general store, the silence followed me. Union is small in the way that makes strangers immediately visible. Conversations slowed when I walked in. Eyes tracked me without interest or curiosity, only recognition, as if they already knew what house I'd chosen. I didn't ask about it directly. I bought coffee, bread, something to justify being there. It was the cashier, a woman in her 60s with hands permanently stained by ink and paper cuts, who finally spoke. "You hear it yet?" She didn't look at me when she asked. I asked her what she meant. She slid my change across the counter carefully, like proximity mattered. "The house," she said. "It don't go it every night, but when it does, you won't mistake it." I told her I'd heard something. She nodded once, not surprised, not alarmed, resigned. "It ain't ghosts," she added, as if correcting a common error. "Ghosts move on. That thing stayed." I asked, "What thing?" She paused, then shook her head. House was already screaming before anyone thought to listen. That afternoon I went back and searched the place properly. Closets, crawl spaces, attic access. I found no speakers, no hidden shafts, no signs of habitation. But in the walls, behind loose panels and cracked plaster, I found insulation packed tighter in some areas, compressed and darkened, as if sound had been forced through it repeatedly. And beneath the stairs, behind a nailed-shut door I hadn't noticed before, I found something worse. The wood there was stained darker than the rest, not spilled, absorbed, layered over time, and carved into the beam, barely visible unless the light hit it just right, were words worn down to near erasure. Not names, instructions, short, repeated, overlapping. "Hold it down. Don't let it breathe. It listens when it stops." That night, I didn't turn off the lights, and when the scream returned, louder this time, deeper, vibrating the floor beneath my feet, I realized the house wasn't making the sound. It was containing it, and something inside had learned when it was being ignored. The scream didn't end cleanly that second night. It fractured. It broke into layers, a high, tearing edge riding over a lower, grinding undercurrent, as if more than one thought was involved, or as if the sound itself was being pulled apart by resistance inside the walls. I felt it in my teeth, in the joints of my fingers. The windows rattled, not violently, but with a tight, anxious tremor, like they wanted to flex outward and couldn't. Then something new happened. The floor beneath the staircase shifted. Not collapsed, not cracked, shifted, as if the weight had redistributed suddenly below. The scream stuttered once, sharp and abrupt, and for a brief instant there was silence so complete it felt louder than the sound itself. I moved before I could think better of it. The door beneath the stairs, the one nailed shut, was no longer flush with the frame. One of the old nails had worked itself halfway free, bent outward at an impossible angle. The wood around it bulged slightly, as if something behind the door had leaned into it and then withdrawn. I didn't touch it. I went to the shed instead. The shed had tools left behind by whoever last believed the house could be fixed. Rusted pry bars, a hand drill older than I was. I chose a flat bar, thin enough to work into the seam without splitting the wood. The door opened reluctantly, boards creaking in protest, but not screaming. That detail mattered. The house objected, but it didn't resist. The space behind it was not a crawl space. It was a room. Low ceiling, bare dirt floor, walls reinforced with uneven planks that had been added later, braced against the original structure like an afterthought meant to correct a mistake. The air was stale and metallic, heavy with the scent of old sweat and something sore beneath it. And the markings, they were everywhere. Not symbols, not warnings, finger gouges. Hundreds of them, carved directly into the wood, overlapping, frantic, angled upward toward the ceiling. Some were shallow, others deep enough to splinter the grain. The density increased toward one corner where the planks were cracked and bowed inward. Something had been pressed there for a long time. I stepped inside and the scream resumed instantly, closer now, directional. It came from below the dirt floor, vibrating upward through the soles of my boots. The soil ripped faintly, subtle enough to doubt if it was happening at all, except for the way the sound distorted as it passed through it. This wasn't a haunting. It was a containment failure. I found a ledger wedged between two wall supports. The pages were brittle, handwritten in several different hands over what looked like decades. No dates, no full names, just entries laid over each other, corrections written in margins, desperate notes added sideways when space ran out. Sound lasted 43 seconds. Pressure increase felt in ribs. Do not allow silence longer than 1 minute. When it listens, it learns. One entry was underlined so hard the paper had torn. The house must never be empty. I understood then why people didn't stay. Leaving wasn't escape, it was negligence. The scream spiked suddenly, violent and sharp enough to knock me backward against the wall. The dirt floor buckled, not breaking, but swelling as if something underneath had drawn a breath. And in that moment, through the layered sound, I heard something else, not screaming, speaking. Not in words, but in rhythm, pauses, patterns. I recognized it the way you recognize a language before understanding meaning. Whatever was beneath the house was not mindless. It was practicing. And the room had not been built to imprison it. It had been built to teach it when to stop. I didn't close the door beneath the stairs, not because I wanted to be brave, because closing it felt dishonest, like pretending the room wasn't there would somehow reset what I already knew. The scream continued in irregular waves, no longer constant, rising and falling as if responding to the new open space above it. That was new. The ledger had mentioned silence as danger, noise as necessity. The implication settled in slowly, unpleasant and unavoidable. The screaming wasn't just a symptom. It was maintenance. I tested it carefully. When I stepped back into the hallway and closed the door to the front room, muffling the sound slightly, the pressure in the house increased. The walls tightened, nails creaked, the scream sharpened, took on a jagged edge that scraped along my spine. When I opened everything again, interior doors, windows cracked just enough to let sound travel, the scream stabilized, lower, more controlled. The house, I realized, wasn't trying to hide the sound. It was dispersing it. That afternoon I went into town again. This time I didn't pretend to browse. I asked directly. No one denied it. They just redirected. A man at the feed store told me the house had been repurposed long ago. A woman at the diner said it had once belonged to a family that kept watch. The minister avoided the word prayer entirely and spoke instead about rotation. How long can someone stay? I asked him. He thought for a moment. Long enough to notice patterns, he said. Not long enough to be useful after. That night, the scream changed. It began to respond. When I moved, it shifted pitch. When I spoke aloud, even a whisper, it modulated slightly, as if adjusting to new frequencies. I tested this again and again, saying nonsense, counting, humming off-key. The sound bent around my voice, not mimicking it, but aligning with it. The ledger's warning echoed in my head. When it listens, it learns. At some point near dawn, the scream faltered, not stopped, weakened. The pitch deeply, unevenly dipped, as if whatever produced it was tiring. The house reacted immediately. Beams popped. Dust rained from the ceiling. The temperature dropped so fast my breath fogged the air. I heard something crack upstairs. Not woods, but glass, followed by a low, wet sound that made my stomach turn. I ran for the stairs despite myself. At the top, one of the rooms had changed. The window had bowed inward, glass spider-webbed but unbroken. The floorboards beneath it were damp, darkened in a wide oval shape, and pressed into them, as if from below, was the faint impression of a face. Not detailed, no features, just the shape of something human-sized forcing itself upward, testing the boundary. The scream surged again, violent and desperate, and the impression retreated. The floor dried almost instantly, leaving behind shallow cracks radiating outward like stress fractures. I understood then what failure looked like. It wasn't the sound stopping. It was the house losing its ability to contain where the sound came from. The scream didn't want out. It wanted access. And the longer it stayed awake, the better it understood the shape of the house that held it, including me. By the fifth night, the house had begun to anticipate me. The scream no longer waited for darkness. It started as soon as I crossed the threshold, low and restrained. Like a held breath finally released, the pressure adjusted instantly, easing just enough to signal recognition, not relief, recognition. I wasn't a visitor anymore. I was part of the system. I returned to the ledger and read it properly this time, not skimming for answers but tracking the handwriting. There were at least 6 distinct hands across the pages, each one deteriorating over time. Early entries were measured, almost scientific. Later ones were shorter, sloppier, as if the writer's hands shook and compared or refused to cooperate. Some names appeared briefly, crossed out. Some entries ended mid-sentence. One note, written sideways along the spine, stood out. You don't stop it. You stand in for what's missing. That line followed me through the house. I tested the idea deliberately. That night, instead of opening the doors, I stayed in the sealed room beneath the stairs. I sat on the dirt floor with my back against the reinforced planks, as close to the source as I dared before. The scream intensified immediately, deepening into something that rattled my ribs and blurred my vision. I didn't move. After several minutes, the sound shifted. It didn't grow louder. It focused. The scream narrowed, compressing into a tighter band of sound that vibrated directly through my chest. The pressure in the walls eased slightly, redistributed away from the upper floors. The house relaxed. I stayed there for hours, barely breathing, until the scream settled into a steady, tolerable pitch. When I finally stood and left the room, the house remained stable. That wasn't coincidence. The role wasn't about enduring the sound, it was about proximity. The previous occupants hadn't been gods or victims. They had been buffers. That explained the ledger's most disturbing pattern. Entries began optimistically, then slowly shifted tone, becoming fragmented, confused, personal. Writers began referring to themselves less and the house more, pronounced blurred. It hurts less when you stay close. It knows where you are. Distance makes it surge. The scream that night followed me when I tried to sleep, not physically, structurally. It echoed in the walls nearest my bed, migrating as I moved, adjusting its resonance to keep itself centered beneath me. When I stopped pacing and lay down, it settled too. In the early morning hours, I felt something new. A vibration, yes, but layered with something else. Expectation, not hunger, not anger, dependence. The house wasn't failing because it was old. It was failing because it had been designed for a role no building could perform forever. It needed a living presence, and living presence wear out. As dawn broke, the scream softened for the first time since I arrived, not weaker, satisfied. That should have frightened me more than it did, because satisfaction implies intent, and intent implies choice. Whatever was beneath the house had learned that I wasn't just listening, I was staying. The house did not let me forget the night I stayed close. By morning, the silence felt altered, not empty, not restful, but evaluative. The scream was absent, yet the pressure remained, spread thin through the walls like a hand resting flat against skin. I could feel it everywhere at once now, no longer concentrated beneath the stairs. The containment had shifted. It had taught it something. The ledger never mentioned this phase directly, but I began to notice a pattern between the lines. Entries would stop for weeks, sometimes months, then resume abruptly in a different hand, always with the same first note written large and heavy as if carved rather than penned. It followed me. That sentence appeared 3 separate times, written by 3 different people. I tried leaving the house that afternoon, not dramatically, no packing, just a drive. I told myself distance would reset whatever fragile balance had formed. I made it less than a mile down the road before the pressure returned, sharp, localized, crushing behind my eyes. The scream followed seconds later, not through the ear, but inside my head. Same pitch, same rhythm, same endless restraint. I pulled over, vomiting onto the gravel shoulder while the sound intensified, vibrating my teeth until they ached. When I turned back toward the house, the pressure eased almost immediately. I didn't make it to the end of the road. Back inside, the house stabilized again, as if relieved. The scream returned to its proper place beneath the stairs, lower now, more controlled, but unmistakably alert. I understood then that proximity wasn't just preferred, it was enforced. That night the house changed its behavior. The scream began responding before I moved. When I stood, it shifted. When I leaned against a wall, the vibration followed. The structure was no longer reacting. It was anticipating. I tested it carefully, changing direction abruptly, stopping without warning. Each time the sound adjusted with only a slight delay. It was learning predictive patterns. I returned to the sealed room and noticed something I hadn't before, The planks reinforcing the walls were newer than the rest of the house, not original, not even from the same decade. Each layer corresponded to a different handwriting era in the ledger. Each caretaker had added to the room, not to strengthen it, to narrow it. The space had been gradually reduced over time, tightened inward, forcing whoever took the role to stay closer, closer still, until the distance between human presence and the thing beneath became minimal enough to satisfy it. A system refined by attrition. Late that night, the scream fractured again, but this time it wasn't distress. It was variation. Short breaks appeared between waves, irregular pauses that felt deliberate. During those pauses, I heard something else, faint but unmistakable. Breathing, not mine, slow, measured, testing the space left by silence. I remembered the warning carved into the beam. It listens when it stops. And now it was doing more than listening. It was mapping. I realized with a sudden clarity that staying too close for too long had consequences beyond endurance. I was no longer just buffering sound. I was giving it a reference point, a living outline to shape itself against. The scream resumed, steady and restrained, but beneath it ran a new undercurrent, not sound, but intention. The house groaned softly, beams adjusting under invisible strain. Containment was no longer about holding something down. It was about preventing something from standing up. And the longer I stayed, the more accurately it learned how tall that thing needed to be.